Hello everyone. In this video we will be talking about how we can start learning ReactJS step by step. So we will be starting with installations. What are the setups and tools required for starting with ReactJS? Then we will move to the components. As you probably aware, we can create two types of components in ReactJS. One is a functional component and another one is a class component. Then we will move to that components communication, like how we can pass data from one component to another component, how we can call the method of another component from another one, and then we will see how we can export the components. Finally, we will create a simple to-do application in which we will be using Bootstrap for the styling purpose. We will be using font awesome icons. We'll create a small to-do application in which we will be cover all the basics you need to know before starting with ReactJS. And then we will create a deployment build and publish our application to the GitHub pages. So output is like the same. We will be hosting our application to this GitHub. We can add the whatever the new task we want to add, like say for example I'll be adding testing. We will have this drop down from which we can select done or pending, and then we'll add a new task. Then it will be displayed over here. We can also update our task. If it is done, you can move it to pending, and if it is pending, you can move it to done. So we can do it from this edit button. We will displaying the to-dos style as per the condition. If the status is done, then we will display it red in color, and if status is pending, then we will display it green in color. We can also remove the to-dos from the list. So this is what you will be expecting after the seeing the video. You can do it yourself. So for the installation, we will require the Node.js. At the time of recording this video, the current version is 12.16. You can have any version greater than 10.x, and we will need this node for the npm node package manager, and then we will need this Facebook create react application GitHub repository. And if you move to this installation guide, you can see we can create a new application via simple writing this command npx create react app, and then whatever the app name you want to give. As an IDE, I'll be using my Visual Studio Code. You can use any IDE, whichever you prefer. I prefer this Visual Studio Code as my IDE. So now as a next step, what I'll do, I'll copy this command, open up my command prompt, and I'll paste it over here, and I'll say instead of my app, create a to-do application, but make sure you should not use an uppercase letters. And I'll say hit enter, and it will create whatever the bundle it required to use in a React application. I will be back when it is done. Alright, so application is created. Now we can simply navigate to the our application. So I would say to do app, and then we can write npm start. So now it will run our application on a localhost 3000, right? So now if we open up our browser, you can see our application is up and running. So now we open the newly created application in our IDE. You can see the first directory is node_modules, and this will contains all the library or dependency which we write in package.json that install inside the node_modules directory. You can see this public directory. It got this index.html. As you know, React is a single page application, So it is the only one HTML, or you can say single file which got rendered when we run our application. And if you can focus on that line number 31, you will find one div with an ID of root. This is the div which got replaced with a root component. So this is index.html. Then inside this public directory you will find that manifest.json file, 2 or 3 like a logo, and this manifest.json file has something to do with an PWS, progressive web application. I'll be coming back to that in later of this video. Then you will have this source directory inside which our entire React application should be there inside the source directory, and app.js is the first component which got rendered when we run our application, and index.js is the file which is rendering this app component in this render method on the div which I showed you on index.html. Remember that div has an ID of a root. So what it will do, it will find for the div with an ID of root, and if find that, then it will replace that div with this an app component. This is how your first component will work. Then on our directory structure, we have this index.css, index.js, and service worker.js. Again, this is a service worker. It has something to do with in progressive web application. So right now we are not focusing into that. Then if we move ahead, we have this package.json. It consists all the dependencies all the dependencies of your React application. So now let us start creating the components. Only to organize our application in a proper way, what I'll do is inside this source directory, I'll create one more directory and I name it to components. So now whatever the components I'll create inside a components directory. So I'll say create a demo component, and in a ReactJS we can create a component in a two different way. One, we can use a function syntax to create a component, and another one is we can use a class syntax to create a component. I'll show you both the approach one by one. First, I'll show you how you can create a component using the class syntax. And to create a component using that class syntax, you have to follow the 3 steps. First, you have to import the React package and a component package from the React library. So I'll say React, and also I'll say component. That's the step number 1, import. Then as a next step, you have to create a class and give it a name, whatever the name you want to give. I'll say name it to the demo and extends component. Alright. Inside that class, you have to use this render method. Now this render method, we are not going to call it anywhere. ReactJS will call it whenever it is required. And inside that render method, I would say return, and whatever you want to display on your components, you have to write it inside a render method. So over here I'll say hello world. Alright. And finally, as a third step, we have to export this demo component. So I'll say export default and the name of my component. This is how we can create a simple component using a class syntax in a ReactJS. Alright, now I want to display this demo component on my browser. So first step is we have to import or call our newly generated component on app.js, because this is the only component which got rendered when we serve our React application. So first step is we have to import a component. So I'll say demo from and the path of our component. So I'll say import it from the components directory and the name of the component is demo. Now this name is totally up to you. You can give it any name. I'll come back to this, but let me first run this demo application. Alright, and I'll save this application, and if everything went correct, you will see hello world is up and running. Now on my demo component, if I want to use this export as an inline syntax, I can remove it from here, and right before my class, I can say export default and a class. Now why this default is required, right? So again, if you use this default right before your class, what you can do is here you can give it any name. Right now our class name is demo and we have given it here a demo. Instead of this demo, if I give it a demo 2, we can still able to render our demo component using demo2 selector name. Now if I save the application and if I rerun the application, you can see the application is still up and running. What I'm saying is, if you use that default syntax or default keyword whenever you are exporting your class, you can assign any name here whenever you are importing your component. Making sense? Now let us say, for example, over here, if I remove that default keyword, and now if I run my application, you can see it is complaining about demo2 is not known. So to import a component, which doesn't have the default keyword, we have to use this curly brackets and the package name, the same package name we are exporting. So in our case, we have used that demo as a class name. So over here, we have to use this syntax if we don't use the default keyword. And now again, if I run the application, you can see the application is again up and running. So if you use the default syntax, you can give it over any name. And if you do not use the default one, then you have to compulsory use the same name, whatever you have given at the time of exporting. Alright. Now as a next step, we will create another component, and that is a functional component. I'll create one more component inside this component directory, and I'll name it to demo1.js. Now inside this demo1.js, I'll create or I'll use the syntax of creating a component using a function. So first we have to import the React package from the React itself, and then what you can use, that function keyword, you can give it a name of demo1, and over here you can say return, and inside that you will use that h1, and I'll say hello from, let's say, function component. So I'll say function component. Alright, and as a final step, you have to export this. So I'll say export default and the name of my component. That default case will be the same for function component also. On your app.js, you have to import your demo1 component. Right? Now if we run the application, you can see this hello from function component is up and running. We can create this function component in a 3 different way. So first one is this. Now as a next syntax, I'll be using that ECMA6 syntax. So I'll say const, name of the function is demo1, and I'm using that arrow function syntax. And inside this, I'll be saying again the same thing, hello from function component. So I'll just copy that thing and I'll get rid of this comments. And now again, if I save the application, you can see the application is still up and running. As a last step, I'll show you the third way of creating a function. So over here, I'll say use that const demo, and I'll using that arrow function, and instead of that curly brackets, I'll be using that round brackets. And what I'll do is I'll say okay, return the same thing over here. I'll get rid of this comments, and now if we save the application, you can see it is still up and running. We can create the functional component in whatever the way you like. These are the different ways of creating a functional component. Now in the next step, we will see how we can pass value from one component to another component. So now I have created two new component with the class syntax, a parent component and a child component, and I'm displaying I am child component and I am a parent component. Now I want to call child component inside a parent component. So I have to import the child component from its path. So I'll say child component, and here I will say okay, render the child component. And now if you run the application, you can see I am a parent component and I am a child component. Alright, now let's say for example I want to pass some value from parent component to my child component. So over here I will create one property. I'll name it to title, and I'll pass a simple text. I am a text from, you can say, parent component. Alright, and now I want to display this title property on my child component. So on my child component, I can do it by simply using a props. Props is a short form of properties. So here I can say this dot, we have to bind it, enclosed it within a JSX syntax. So we have to use curly brackets, and inside that curly brackets I'll say this dot props dot the name of your property. Alright, and now if I save and if everything went correct, you can see the text I am a text from parent component, it is also displaying in a child component. Now certainly you want to check the same thing for a function component, and you cannot have this inside that functional component. So how we can pass or how we can display a props for a functional component? So now say for example on my parent component, let us say we also want to call our demo1 component, which is a functional component, right? So here I'll say demo1 from, again both are in a same package, so I'll say demo1, and right after the child component I would say render my demo1 component, and again I want to pass one more property, let's say title, and I am a text for, let's say, functional component, and I want to display the same title on my demo1 component, which is a functional component. We can do it by simply using props, but in this case we do not have this keyword, because this keyword is only available when we have a class. Alright, so now we have to take props as an argument. Over here again I'm saying you use that header tag, and using that let's say JSX syntax, and I would say props dot whatever the name of your property. And again if I run the application, you will see I am a text from a function component. Making sense? This way we can pass value from parent to child component. Now as a next step, I'll be creating one sample component, and inside that sample component I want to create one variable, and I want to display it on my component, as well as I want to create one button, and I want to create its method. So whenever user press that button, something will happen. Alright, so for that what I'll do is on my sample component, I'll say let's say h1, and I want to display one variable over inside that h1. So we have to use that state. So I can say state, and inside that state I'll be creating one you can say variable, and I name it to a, and I'll assign it some value, let's say hello. Alright, and now I want to display this a inside this header tag. We can use simple that JSX syntax, single curly bracket, and inside that curly bracket we can say this dot state dot whatever your variable name, and I'll press save, and if everything went correct, you can display that hello on your component. Now as a next step, I want to have one button. So I'll have one button. I'll say it is a type of button to prevent the form submission. It's not a type of submit. And then I'll say click me. And what I want to do is whenever user press this button, I want to change the heading of my text. So here I will say instead of hello, I want to display it, you press the button. So for that I want to create a click event for this button. So I'll use that on click. Now this on click, I'll be calling my method. So over here I would create one method, and I'll say handle button click, and I would say I'm using that arrow function syntax, and inside that function I'll be saying, let's say this dot state dot a, and I'll assign it some value, say for example you pressed button. Make sense? And I'll also create a console inside button click to display whether the click event is working or not. And now if I run the application, okay, before running the application I have to call that function over here. So again I'm using that JSX syntax, and I'll say use that handle button click. And now if I save the application and run it on my browser, I'll open up the console, and if I press this click me, you can see text doesn't change. But if you see over here, your event is still firing because it is displaying your inside from button click event, right? But if you see the warning, do not mutate state directly. Instead, use set state method. So we cannot use that variable directly. We cannot mutate it. Instead, we have to use a set state method. So instead of this approach, what we have to use is this dot set state, and inside that set method we have a new value. So over here I'll say you click button, and now if I run the application again and if I press the button, you can see you click the button. So now so far we have covered a lot of things in ReactJS. We've seen the installation, we've seen how to create the components, both functional and a class. We have seen the props, state, and the use of a default keyword. Now as a next step, we will use the concepts which we already covered, and we will try to create a simple to-do application, what I showed you in the starting of the video. So now I have created a to-do list component. Inside that to-do list component, I want to create my array to-dos, and that to-dos will consist of 2-3 dummy objects, and I want to loop through that ARR and display it on my component. So here I'll create a property state, and inside that property I'll create my array of to-dos. So over here I'll say to-dos, and inside that I'll create two objects, and now on my render method I want to look through this ARR, and then I want to display it in my component. So over here I'll say use a table tag. Inside that table tag I'll say thead, and I'll say tr, and I want to display some table heading. So I will duplicate this table headings 2-3 times, and what I want to do is I'll place some title over there, ID, title, you can say status, and then action. Now in my table body I'll be having one row, and that row is consist of 4 columns, but I want to look through my to-dos array. So over here I'll be using that JSX syntax, and I'll say this dot state dot to-dos and map. The map will look through my array and it will display one item one by one. So inside this map I'll be using that arrow function syntax, and I'll say return, and inside that return statement I'll create my row. So this row should consist of 4 columns. So over here I'll duplicate these columns, and I will use that JSX syntax, and I'll say x.id, then again same thing, x.title and x.status. So over here I'll say title, instead of id I'll say status, and in this 4th column I want to have some buttons for update and delete. Right now I'll place a simple button, then we will see how we can render the buttons through that SVG icons. If we save everything and if everything went correct, we will see 2 of our to-dos on the component. This is it. It displays our to-dos on our HTML. Now, before further diving with the demo, let me just show you how we can use a Bootstrap and that font awesome icons with ReactJS. So to use a Bootstrap locally in a ReactJS application, first I'll install Bootstrap via this npm, and then I'll go through these 3 steps for that font awesome icons. And for the Bootstrap, I can also copy the CDN from its official website. So what I'll do is, next on my React application, first I'll say npm install, and I'll say Bootstrap. So it will install Bootstrap to my local Angular React application, and then I will use that in an action. So Bootstrap is got installed, and then now on our index.html I'll put that CSS and JavaScript. So on my index.html I'll say add this reference for a Bootstrap. Now on my to-do list component, if I apply the style on this table tag, I'll say class name. Now in ReactJS you cannot use the class directly, instead you can use class, and over here I'll say the table. So this table is in just a CSS comes with a Bootstrap. Then instead of this delete button, simple delete button, I want to use that icon button. So for that I'll be using that font awesome commands. So let me just copy the commands one by one. I'll first install the SVG core on my React application. So here I'll say npm install and that SVG core. Then next we will be installing that SVG icons and SVG icons package. So again I'll say on my npm install and svg icons, and then as a last step we will need that React Font Awesome library. So I'll also copy that, and on my ReactJS application, let it finish first svg icons, then I'll also install that React Font Awesome library. So as a last step, I'll say React Font Awesome library and let it finish first, and then I'll show you how we can use that Font Awesome libraries with ReactJS. So now we have installed everything. Now again I'll say npm and start to run my React application, and let it build the React application first, and till that we will see how we can use that Font Awesome icons in our application. So first we have to create a library. So I'll open up my app.js file, and on my app.js file we have to create a library first. So whatever the icons we want to use, we have to create a library. So on my app.js I'll say import as a statement, and I'll be importing a Font Awesome svg core, and I'll create the library first. So I'll say library, and then I'll also import the free solid svg icons. So I'll say add Font Awesome svg icons, and from that I'll be using 3 of the icons. One is a trash icon for the delete button, and I'll say, let's say, use that trash. Then another one I'll be using that for a add button, so I'll say far plus, and the third one I'll be using Font Awesome edit button. Alright, and then here I have to say library.add, and I'll be adding those buttons to my library collection. So here I'll say far.trash, then I'll say far edit and far plus. So that will be added to my library collection. Now on my to-do list component, say for example, instead of that simple edit button, if I want to use that icon button, I can use it by simply using that Font Awesome icons. So on my component, first I have to import, and I'll say as a statement, and here we need to import that third package, React Font Awesome package, and from that I'll be using Font Awesome icon. And now instead of that simple delete button, what I'll be using here, I'll be using a span, and inside that span I'll say use that Font Awesome icon, and the name of the icon would be trash. So here I'll say trash. Alright, and now if I save everything, and if everything went correct, we can see that HTML, you can say like that table will got expand because of that table class, and you can see we have this delete icon on our button. In the same way, I'll be using that edit button also. So I'll just duplicate this button, and right after that I'll use one separator, and after that I'll be saying instead of that trash, I'll be using that icon name to the edit. Now you can see both edit and delete in action. Now as a next step, we will create that click listener for this delete button. So now on my delete button, I will also apply one class, and I'll say, let's say button and btn primary. So it is just in Bootstrap CSS which I apply to my class, and then I'll say on click, and I want to use that JSX and JavaScript syntax to create the callback. I'm using that arrow function, and I'll say let's say this dot delete to do, but let me first create a to do method first. So on my out of my render method, first I'll create a delete to do method. So over here I'll say delete to do, which expects as an argument whatever the record we want to delete, it expects as an argument. So here I'll say to do, and inside that delete to do method I'll be using that this dot set state. Remember, I told you you cannot mutate the array directly. So here I am using the set state method, and inside that set state method I'll be using that filter method, and I'll update my ARR. So over here I'll say const and filtered items, and over here I'll say this dot let's say state dot to do's dot filter, and what I want to do is inside that filter method I can say using that arrow function x dot id is not equal to to-dos dot id. So whatever the to-do we passed as an argument, that id should not be present in a filtered items. And now what I'll do is I'll update that filtered items to original to-dos. So over here I'll say to-dos, and inside that to-dos I'll be passing my filtered items. Making sense? Now on my that click event on the button, what I want to do is I want to call this delete to do method. So on my on click I'll be saying call that this dot delete to do method, and also pass current object or current to do as an argument. Making sense? So if now I'll save the application and rerun it on my browser, you can see that btn style is applied, and now if I remove the record, it will be removed from my collection. Alright, the same way I want to do the edit logic for my button. So again on my React application, let me just apply this class and create on click method. So over here I'll say apply that class and also call that edit method. But before that, first we have to create the edit method. So right after that delete to do method, I'll create one more method and I'll name it to edit to do, and again that method will require to do item as a parameter. So inside that I'll be saying okay, it will require that to do parameters as an argument, and then I'll be using that set state method. So here I'll be saying inside that set state method, what I'm doing is I'm looping through my array, and what I check is if that id match with a record we passed, then only we want to update the status column. So here I am using that spread operator, and I'll be keeping intact id and title as it is, and I'm just updating my status. If it is done, then I'm changing it to pending, and if it is pending, I'm changing it to done. If id doesn't match with record, I'm returning that to do as it is. Alright, now on my edit button over here, I'll be calling that method. So instead of this delete to do, I'll be calling that edit to do. And now I'll save the application and run it on my browser. If everything went correct, you can see we can edit this pending to the done, and again done to the pending. So now as a next step, what I want to do is I want to display this status as per the condition. Like if the status is done, I want to display it in a green in color, and if status is pending, then I want to display it in a red in color, right? So on my React application here, where I'm displaying the status on my column, I'll be using that inline styling. So here I'll say style, and instead of passing the hard-coded value, I'll be using that JSX syntax. So inside that JSX syntax, I would say color, and that color should be depend on the condition. So here I'm saying x.status, if it is equals to, and here I'm also checking for the type. If it is equals to done, then I'm using the ternary operator. Then apply the green color, and if the condition is false, then you should apply the red color. Alright, making sense? Again I'm repeating, instead of using that hard-coded style, I'm using that JSX syntax, and here I'm using the condition. If the value of the status is done, and apply the green color, and if the value of status is not equal to done, then apply the red color. And now if everything went correct, you can see that done is displayed in a green in color, and this pending is displayed in a red in color. Now as a next and a final step, we will see how we can add new to-do to our list. So now again I have created a new component, and I name it to add to-do component, and inside that add to-do component, I'll create one form, and inside that form we will have our entire to-do component. So add to-do component. So I'll say div, and inside that div I'll be having one input, and alright, so let me just do some CSS things. So I'll say class name, and I'll be using form control, and input, instead of form control I'll be saying form group and on my input I'll say class name, and that I'll be using form control. Now I just duplicate this for ID and title. Again I'll be using that placeholder, and I'll say enter ID. I'll be using that placeholder for the title also. So here I'll say enter title, and for that status I'll be using select an option for a drop down. So here I'll say form group, and inside that we will be using select. That select we will apply a class name, and we will say form control. Inside that option, let's say I want to give two option done, and I'll also send its value to done. I'll duplicate this same thing for the pending, right? So I'll say option, and I'll duplicate this for pending, and also for the value pending. Alright, so it's just a simple form having two input boxes and one drop down. Now after that div, I'll be having one button, and that button should be type of submit, because now we want to submit entire form. And I'll say add to do, and also I want to apply one CSS. So I'll say class name, and I'll say btn primary. Now these are the CSS comes with a Bootstrap. So we have created our simple form, and now on my to-do list component I'll be importing that add to do component, because we have our array here. So whatever the value user enters on add component, we will pass it to our parent component, and we have to create this add method over here. But first let me import. So I'll say import, let's say add to do from, and I'll assign it the path. So both are in the same component. So I'll say add to do, and let me render that add to do right before the to do list component. So over here I'll say add to do, and now if I save and if everything went correct, you can see that add to do in action. So enter ID, title, your drop down is working, right? Now as a next step, we will see how we can add this to-dos, or first we will see how we can fetch the values of inputs and drop down, and then we will pass it to our array. On my button, I just forgot to give it a style, and I'll say it to be a form control. Alright. So now if I run the application, you will see the button full of size. Alright, so now let's move ahead with fetching the values. So for that we will first see how we can get the value of an input box. So to fetch the latest value of the input box, what I'll do is I'll first create a method. So over here I'll say handle ID change, and I'll say I'll be using that arrow function, and on my handle ID change I'll be using that inbuilt event as an argument. So event object as an argument. Now on my input box I'll be calling my onChange method. So over here I'll say onChange, and I'll be calling that this dot, you can say handle ID change. Now you do not need to require to pass that event object, because it will be passed automatically. It will be the object of your DOM. And let's say whatever the value inside this input box, I want to assign it to my local property, local variable. So first let me create one property using that state. So I'm using that state. Inside that state I'll be creating one property, and I'll name it to ID. Now again, we will be required three property: ID, title, and status. So again I'll be creating these three properties, and the last one is a status. And I'll be initializing with it with some empty value. For status I'll be initializing with pending value. And now let us say whatever the latest input user have entered, I want to assign it to this ID. Now you know how we can apply or how we can use that ID. You guess it correctly, we have to use that setState method. So inside that setState method we will call our ID. So here I'll say ID and assign it a new value, latest value. So again I'll be using that event.target.value, and event.target.value, and also to display it like we are having that value, what I'll do is I'll be having some console.log, and I'll say event.target.value, so that we will come to know like it is having a value of the latest input or not. So now let me just navigate to this and open up my console, and let's say Bootstrap warning is there, and now let us say if I press ID, you will see it is displayed here on my console. So the same thing I want to apply for that title for. So again here I'll say handle title change, and again I'll be doing the same thing, and inside that object I'll be saying like this dot set state, and again I'll say title, and I'll say event dot target dot value. and the same thing for the status. So I'll say handle status changed, and I'll say event. So again for that I'll be saying like this dot set state, and inside that set state I'll be saying like status, and that should have a value of like event dot target dot value. So now our all properties have the latest value. We will also use that values when we submit our form. So to submit our form, we will using that form submit event. So on my form I'll be using that on submit event. So let's on submit, and for that on submit again we are calling our method. But before that, let me just call the handle change for every input, right? So we have done it for the ID, but we need to do it for title also. So again on change I'll call that this dot handle dot titles change. In the same way we can use it for a select. So over here I'll say on change, and also I want to use that this dot handle dot status change. Now in the case of select or you can say drop down, what we want is you want your default value to be selected. Like say for example my default value is pending, then from the drop down list you want to have default value of a pending to be selected. So again in a normal HTML we have like selected property, but in ReactJS we can make it selected through the value property. So over here we can simply say this dot state dot, you can say status. So whatever your status having a value, default value, that will be the default value for your drop down. And now if I save this and if everything went correct, we can see that that form is up and running. But now we want to submit the entire form, and for that we have to create the on submit. So first we will create a method handle on submit. So over here I'll say handle to do submit, and we will do the same argument events, and you can say that DOM object. Now if we use that submit button and if we press it submit, it will send the entire form to the server, but we don't want to do that. So we have to use event dot prevent default, and that prevent default will prevent it to submit the entire form. Alright, and then as a next step what we can do is we can just simply console dot log, and let's say this dot state dot let us say title, and we can do the same thing for status to check like before submitting the actual to do, to check like we are able to find it or not for the latest value. And now if we run the application and if everything went correct, we can see it in action. Now again it is showing us some error. On submit is a we need to pass the on submit reference over there. So on our on submit method over here we will call that method. So here we will say this dot handle to do submit. And now again if I save the application and if I run it, you can see let me fill the form and open up my console, and I'll say ID, let us say title, so I'm saying it a test, and instead of pending I'll say done. And if I press this, you can see we have the latest values. Alright, so now as a next step, we will see how we can pass these latest values to the parent component. And we will call the add to do method from our to do list. So now on our to do list component, what I'll do is right after that delete and to do method, I'll be having add to do method. So here I'll say add to do, and again as another functions, it will be take to do as a parameter. And what we have to do, we have to add this new to do to our existing list. So inside this add to do method, I'll be using this dot set state, and inside that set state method, I'll be using that to do's array, and I'll be using that spread operator. So what I'll use that this dot state dot to do's. So whatever the values inside your to do's, keep it intact, and now also merge this new to do. So that is the to do. We pass it from a child component. Making sense? Now remember the case, your add to do method is on your parent component, that's your to do list component. Your array is on your parent component. Make sense? Now we are calling this add to do component, or user will pass the values to the add to do component. Now over here on your parent component, we are calling this add to do method, right? So we can use that props. And again, inside that add to do component, what I'll do, I'll create one prop and I'll say on add, and then I want to call this dot add to do method. Making sense? Again, on my add to do component, what I have to do is I have to call that prop whenever user submits the form. So on my add to do component, let us say add to do component, and here handle to do submit. So we have the values, and now over here what I want to do is I want to use that props, and on add is my prop name, which I want to fire when user submits the form. And inside this form I'll be passing my latest values. So over here I'll say id, and I'll pass it this dot state dot id, latest value from my state property. Then I'll say title, and the same goes to the title. So I'll say this dot state dot title, and again last is a status, and I'll pass it this dot state dot you can say status. Make sense? And then after submitting that value, I want to clear my form again. So again this dot set state, and I'll be assigning some values to my state property. So I'll say id to empty, then title to again I'll say empty, and status I want to assign it some default value to pending. And now again if I save the application, and if everything went correct, you can see the newly added to do like taste, and the status is I'll say to done. It should add to our list, and again if you can see that list should be updated. But again this you can see that input box should be clear. Why it is not clearing? Just let me check it first. Okay, so we are updating the states id, title and status, but we are not binding it to the controls, not binding it to the input box. So to do so, what we have to do, we have to use that value property of an input box. So over here what we can do is value, and we can use that JSX syntax, this dot state dot let's say id, and the same thing goes to that title also. And now again, if we run the application, and you can say open up the console. So if we are having some errors, we can check it over there. So id 3, you can say test, and I'll say status to done. Again, it is there and form is cleared. Here you can see one error with an jQuery, so that's fine. We does not want to dive into that, but there is a warning for our each child in a list should have a unique key property, right? So that's because we forget to set the unique property, the key property of our list. So on my to-do list, whenever we are binding this list to our map method, over here ReactJS giving you the key property, like you can assign your primary key to this key property. So here I'll say x.id, and now again if I save this application and let me open up my console, so that warning just goes away. Alright, so we have created a simple to-do application. Here you can add your to-do, done and pending. You can update it, whatever it states, done, pending, update, whatever you want to do. You can remove it from the list. This is how you can create a simple to-do application using ReactJS. Now, as a next and final step, I will show you how you can deploy ReactJS application to the GitHub pages. So now to publish our application on a GitHub, I already logged into my GitHub account. Then you can create a new repository, and on that new repository I'll name it to like you can say to do React app, and I'll create the repository. Then after successfully created the repository, we just need to copy this command. You can say git remote add origin and the URL, right? So now what I have to do is I'll be just opening my application. I'll stop it from the serving. So I'll stop the command prompt, and as a first step we have to open that package.json of our React application. So I'll open up package.json. First we have to create one property over here, and I'll say it home page, and that home page should be like this: https and www. What is your GitHub username? So it is like gmail.999.github.io, and then the name of your project. So in my case, the project name is to do React app. Alright, so I need to pass it over here. So I'll say to do React app. Alright, again I'm repeating the URL. Whatever your username .github.io, and this is the name of your repository. Then on a script, you have to create a new script, and I can say deploy script, and over here I'll say like gh pages -d and build. Alright, so now we want to publish this repository to the GitHub pages. So as a first step, we have to add our Git URL, and for that what I have to do, I can copy this simple command git remote add origin, and I can copy paste from the GitHub, and I'll paste it over here. Then as a next step, instead of this add parameter, I'll say set URL. Alright, and I'll say run. So then finally we can say npm run build, and it will create a production build for us. It will take a while. I'll be back when it is done. So now our production build is ready, and if you open up your directory, you can see this build folder is generated with that command, and it has our production build. And now what I have to do is I'll write one more command, and I'll say npm run deploy. Remember, we created this script in our package.json. Now it will host our application to the GitHub pages. And if you encounter this error gh pages, you have to install npm gh pages. So over here I can say npm install gh pages and -- save and developer dependency. So again it will install the GitHub pages tool for us, and then we can again run that deploy command. So it will take a while. I'll be back when it is done. So now, as a next and a final step, again we have to run that npm run deploy, and now we have that gh pages installed. So it will be installing our application to the GitHub page, and it will take a while to create a build and deploy it to the GitHub. Once it is done, I'll show you the URL. Alright, so now you can see the message published, and congratulations, your first React app, it got published to the GitHub pages. Now to visit your GitHub pages, let me navigate you to the GitHub where we created our repository. And if you navigate to the settings tab, you can find your repository or the URL where your application is up and running. See, if you navigate down, you will see the GitHub pages, and over here you will have your URL. So now if I click that URL, you can see your first React application is up and running. Now again you can enter any ID, any title, let's say testing, and you can say pending and add. Your ad is working. You can update it, you can delete it. So everything is up and running.